Welcome to Lesson 5 in the ASP.NET MVC UI add-on course. In this lesson, we're going to add the web forms necessary in MVC to view all the people possible, to edit a person, to create a new person, and to even delete a person. So let's jump right in. So over here, in our Tracker UI project, we have the Create Team form. And inside there, we nested this little Add New Member. And so let's add a new team member, and then it also put them on the list for a team. We're going to separate out this functionality into two pieces. And the reason for that is because this bumps into an issue that's going to cause a few issues with our project, and that's the stateless nature of MVC, meaning we don't remember information on the page between calls. So for example, if I were to say create member, that causes a page refresh. So if I had already put in the team name but hadn't saved it, it'd get blown away and it'd be blanked out. That's kind of a problem. And that's the stateless nature of MVC, the idea that it doesn't remember what the page state was like before you hit or after you hit submit, except for the form that actually changed. And so we really want to break apart anywhere where we're modifying a form. We want to break that apart into just one modification section. So create team means we should only have things related to the actual team, not team members. And so we'll break that apart. So let's take this section right here, add new member, and we'll call it person probably. And let's add this as a new controller. So we'll say right click on controllers and say add controller. And here you've got a whole bunch of options here. You've got MVC controller empty, which is typically the one that I do whenever I'm just want to build something, custom for me. But then there's the controller with read-write actions. This is kind of fun. It has a create, read, update, delete, and list entries for it. That's the one we'll be using today. But then down here, notice there's one for Entity Framework. We don't use Entity Framework. I'm not a big fan. So we'll ignore that one. And then there's Web API 2. And there's a whole bunch of them there. We're not going to touch those either. Web API is a totally different animal. We're going to touch that later. So we're going to go with the MVC5 controller with read-write actions. If I hit add, the controller name, we're going to call this controller the people controller. And it's going to build it out for us. Okay, so now we have our set of information. And there's a whole bunch of information here. So let's start at the very top. We have the index page, which is a view. We have the details page. We have a create page. We have the post for the create page. That's the data coming back once they hit submit. Then we have our edit of a person and the post for the edit. We have our delete and we have our post for the delete. There's a lot of stuff. Let's just see what happens if we boot this up. So right off the bat, it's not going to change our home page because that would require us to actually make a modification of the links. But if we were to go /people, that's what we get. Nothing. It blows up on us. And so if you see this, don't freak out. controller action. Okay. The view index or its master was not found, and no view engine supports the search location. The following locations were searched. This is amazing. It tells us how it's thinking. So the first thing it did, it looked for /views, /people, /index.aspx. That's the first thing it looks for. But then it says, oh, can't find that. So I go to views, /people, /index.ascx. All right. Nope, can't find it. Then it goes to the shared folder and said, well, the shared folder everyone has access to, so it could be there. So views /shared /index.aspx and ascx. Nope, didn't find it. So then it says, well, maybe it uses the old, let's just look up for CS/HTML. So we go to people /index.cshtml. I'm sorry, it's a new, not the old. The new CS/HTML, nope. How about VB for Visual Basic? Because you can actually mix those two. But nope. Again, in the shared for index.cshtml and vb.html. Once it gets through all of those, it says, you know what? I just can't find it. Therefore, we crash. And this is the ugly crash message, which you will only see this type of message, as long as it's set up right. You'll only see that if you're running on the machine that's hosting this website. The reason for that is because you don't want to give this to your customers. You don't want to show your customers all of this code. Now, this isn't really important code necessarily, but when you have an error in your C#, it will be important code, and you don't want to show that. Plus, this is not exactly a pretty page to show your customers. It gives them no information about what to do. You want to give them a nice, 404 page if it's, page not found, or some other error page that says what to do now. So this only gets displayed to our developers. But okay, what's the problem? Well, if we come back over here to our list, we see we have our controller called people. But then down here under views, we have a folder called people, cool, but nothing inside it. So we have no views that correspond with this action. And the reason for that is because we haven't actually specified where the list of data comes from. And so it doesn't know what type of data to display. Therefore, it hasn't scaffolded out those pages. But don't worry, it's really easy. But first, let's get our list of people. So if we come back down here to our create team form and go to the code, let's figure out how to get our team members. Right here we have globalconfig.connection.getPerson_all. Well, that's how we figure out the list of people. So let's come back over here. Let's paste this in. We'll do our control dots to add our using statements. One there, one there. And now we have a list of person model. So now we can say, here are the available team members, which is essentially, we actually can change this name to be entered people. That way, it's a little more clear what this is. These are the people that are entered in the database. We could also call available people. Let's call it available people. Notice I can control dot here and say rename. I hit enter and it changes this one down here as well. When I have just one, I usually just copy and paste. It's just quick. But control dot also does it really nicely for me. So now I have this list of people and I'm passing it to my view. And this index view is going to be the list of all of my people. So how do I create this page? Well, I right click on index and say add view. And it's going to say, what is this? Well, it's a list page. What's your model type? And we need to find our model type here. Now the only problem is I don't see, oh, there it is. I have my person model right there. Great. So it found it even though it's in a different library. That's amazing. I love it. The rest we can leave alone and we hit add. Check this out. It create up here our app model and we have our IEnumerable of person model. And then it created this whole page of information. Now we're going to leave this alone right for now. We're not going to touch it. I want to see it first. So let's hit the play button on this and load up this page. Now because I was on that page, that CS HTML page, it's actually going to go right to that route instead of going to the home page. So here's my list of, it says index up here, not a big fan, but okay, create new, and then it has first name, last name, email address, cell phone number, full name, and it has all my information. This is amazing. This is incredible. How did it get all this information laid out? Well, what happened is it took that model and said, I know what properties you have. Let's go ahead and create a table and list those properties. And it did, which, again, I find amazing. So a lot of the work has already been done for me on this list people page. Now, I might not want to display everything. Maybe I don't want to list cell phone number on this page. No problem. I can come back here, take out this header row, and I can take out this data row. And again, the for each loops through each item in the model. But we're going to leave it alone for now, and let's create the rest of the pages first. The only one we're not going to create is the delete. I'm on the fence right now about having delete. I think for now we'll at least comment it out. Okay, and that's fairly easy to do. We'll just hit the comment button, and now it's commented out. Notice the at and then the star. That's a special way of commenting out razor syntax pages. But that way that delete button doesn't show up because I'm not sure I want to have that delete. First of all, I'm not sure we have the endpoint for it for people. And second of all, if we were to delete a person, how would that work as far as if they're already in a team, it's already in a tournament? So that's a little quirky. We can look into it more as we go. But for right now, I'll just comment it out. So let's go back to our people controller and come down here to our details view and say, what do we need to do here? Well, the details view is just essentially that same information as in the row. It's just if you wanted to have more details. Say you only put first and last name in the table, in the list, but you click details, you could see their phone number and email address. That's what details does for us. I'm not sure we really need it to have a separate one, so let's get rid of that. And we'll come back over here to our index page and we'll get rid of this details here. All right, we can actually get rid of this pipe as well since there's no second item here. All right, so details is gone, but create we want. So what do? We have a create page. Well, we right click on create, add new view. We want this to be a create page. The model class is the person model. And that's it. We hit add. And now it's scaffolded out a page for create as well. We'll come back to what these pages are and how to tweak them a little bit to make them look better. But for now, let's just keep going and work on the other pages like the edit page. So the edit page, we can scaffold this out as well. Now you won't actually use the edit form, but I want you to see how MVC builds it. So let's go ahead and hit add for this as well. Oops. And I accidentally added it without adding our model. So let's delete it and start over. So right click on edit, say add view. When you change the model, we say edit for the template type, and the model type is the person model. Now we hit add, and there we go. A little more full featured. So let's hit start again. Let's go back to our index to make sure our index controller, our people controller, that's better. Let's make sure we have everything else. We don't need to delete. We'll at least comment this out so that we don't accidentally use it. We'll come back to if we need it or not. But let's go ahead and hit start right now. Now we haven't dealt with the post for either of these forms, but that's okay. Okay, so now if I were to go /people and hit enter, now I have my list of people, which is again really tiny, and we'll take care of that in a minute. But for right now, let's hit the edit on Tim Corey. Now the boxes are empty because I haven't actually loaded that particular entry. But I want you to see that it has a first name, last name, email address, and cell phone number label with their associated text box. And that's amazing. That's great. Notice also it says edit /1. And that /1 is important because that's the ID for Tim Corey. If I were to go back to the list and say, let's edit Mary Jacobs, notice it's /6. That's her ID. So it's intelligent enough to know which ID to use. Now let's take a look at the code behind this edit page. So we go to edit.cshtml. A couple things to note, and this is kind of a sidetrack just to kind of give you an overview of what's going on here. First of all, the anti-forgery token. That's a token that kind of helps with man-in-the-middle attacks, where it says you have to be a form that came from our website in order for me to accept the post of it. Meaning if you send me data, but you came from a different website, I won't allow that. It has to be our form. And so that's a protection system that's very easy to use. This already comes baked in, but then you just put over your post method, you put to use the anti-forgery. That's it. And we'll use that in a future form. But for now, the other thing I want to point out is we have validation. There's our hidden model ID. And notice these text boxes, like the editor for, is very much a C# way of doing things, not an HTML way of doing things. It builds the HTML, but what happens is it says, give me an editor for the first name field. Well, the first name field is a text field. So it's a very straightforward text editor. But if it were a Boolean field, you'd probably have a checkbox. And so that is really powerful. And then it adds things like, oh, I want this to have a class of form control. And I want to have a validation message for the first name underneath that editor. And so next to that editor. And so all of that adds up to a really full-featured form without a lot of work on your part. And we'll use these forms in the future, but if we look back at let's go back over here, we don't have a place to edit or delete team members. And all we have is a place to add new members or to select existing ones. And so since we're keeping these applications similar, we don't want to try and add new functionality now to edit or delete people when the reality is that that's a whole lot of work in the back end, and that's not what this video is about. Right here, and look at this create member, we notice that we validate the form, which we'll look at that in a minute, but that's just this down here, making sure that all 4 values have a value. Then we create a person model. We do this global config.connection.create person, and then we add them to the team. Well, we're not going to add them to the team because we're not dealing with teams in our people form. So all the rest of this stuff goes away, and the fields get wiped out by default because the page refreshes, even if we were to stay on that page. So let's grab this. The create team form, or create person form, I'm sorry. So I went to the view for create people, and I hit play. And the reason why is because that will then load directly to that create page instead of making me navigate to it by saying /people/create. So I'm going to fill the information in, just pretend it's going to be all right. So Tim Corey, test@tim.com, and 555-1212 for my cell phone number. And I hit create. And I pop into code. That's because we can debug on the fly, even in a web application like MVC. So now I can mouse over collection and look at all the information. We can see in the results view, collection, at position 0, we have the token. last name. Let's actually copy this end section just so it's a little bit easier. And say p.email address equals, and change this to be email address. And the last one, oops, before this would be p.cellphone number. There we go. So now I've populated this model, and if I move my breakpoint down here, we'll see if it actually has the full person populated. So let's run this again, and we'll see where I start off. Notice I start in the home page because I was in the people controller, not in the create.cs HTML file. So let's go to /people/create. The other thing I could do is go to /people and then say create new. Let's say Tim, Corey, tim@test.com. 5551212. Hit create. Let's look at the person object, the P. I mouse over that. I can expand this out and see the cell phone number, email address, first name, and last name are all populated properly. And the full name. The full name is one of those read-only properties that actually takes two different properties and puts them together. And the ID is 0 because this is a new person. With that being said, that should be all we need to create a person. Now, what do we do after we create a person? Well, let's take this to-do out. We send them back to the list. And the list is actually called index. So return redirect to action index. So if we successfully create a person, we add that person to our set of people, and then we return to our list of people so you can see that person in the list. Now, this is all inside of a try-catch by default. That's what Microsoft does for us, which is great. I say that a lot, but Microsoft has done some wonderful things inside MVC. So inside the catch, we have return view. So what does this do as opposed to this? Well, this redirects them to a different page, whereas this right here, what it does is it returns the same page. In this case, the create page. Now, that's a different method, but I know it returns this one over this one because this one is a post. It has the same name though, and so it says, okay, I need the create view and I need to get it. This is a get call, which means I'm going to call this one. By default, if you don't specify a type up here, then the default is HTTP GET. So if we mess up in the form, if it crashes the application, if it somehow bombs out of this try, we're going to load the create page all over again. Now, if we do that, the create page will be blank. It won't have any of our information saved. Now, there's ways you can get around that, but by default, that's what happens. So let's see this in action. We won't stop it this time. We won't hit the breakpoint. I took the breakpoint out. We'll just let it run as is. So let's start by going to /people and saying, now we have a Tim Corey already, but we have a Sue Storm, but let's see if we can add somebody new. So let's say new, and we'll say Bob Hope, and Bob at Hope be on the CS HTML page. So now we have no edits over here. That's good. Let's change this font size. So we hit F12 and we mouse over. Let's do over one of the entries first. And then let's figure out what's going on with this CSS. So where's font size? We can scroll down here and see that table, the font size by default is 12. That's horrific. On a web page these days, your default font size should be at least 16. It's just wiser that way, especially when you get into mobile forms where you're viewing on a smaller phone and that font size is ridiculously tiny compared to the entire screen. So definitely have a larger font size. I think the standard anymore for a lot of designers is 18, but I would say at least a 16 to get started. So let's change that for everything. I don't anticipate a reason why you wouldn't have it be larger. So bootstrap.css, line number 8270. So let's go to bootstrap.css. That's in the content folder. Line 8270. And save that file. And now if we were to hit refresh on this, it goes away, which is interesting. But that's because we haven't compiled yet that bundle. And that's one of the downsides of those bundles is you have to actually recompile them. It's a little bit of a pain, but it's doable. All right. So the other thing, let's just change this back just so we can see it a little better. Let's just change it to 18 to see what it looks like. A little too big probably, but for now, it's good enough for you to see for demonstration purposes. Notice how it says first name, no space, last name, no space. Class library. Now, I'm not a huge fan of modifying our class library, but in this case, we're not going to be changing something. We'll be adding an extra feature that can be ignored by most applications. So let's open up Tracker Library, go to Models, look at the person model. So over first name, I want to change this so that it says given name. So I'm going to hit enter here, take away the comments, and I'm going to say, open up the square braces and say display. I hit control dot to give me the, I have to add the reference to system.componentModel.dataAnnotations.dll. I'm going to do that. So in case you didn't know, what that just did is it right-clicked on references, add a reference, found that DLL, referenced it, and then up here, add a using statement for it as well. That's a really handy shortcut, is to do it all at once when it figures it out. So this is an annotation. This is metadata about this property. So I'm saying the display for this, the name should be given name. So instead of first name, it's going to be given space name. And that's the display property, the display name. I do the same thing for last name, and I'll just call it last name, but I'll at least have a space then in it. Last name. Email address, same thing. Email address, and then cell phone number. Like so. Now, full name, we could do the same thing if you wanted to, but I'm not going to display it, so I'm not going to add metadata for it. So I'm going to save that, and now without touching anything else, let's hit run. All right, so let's go to /people. Now, it didn't save those CSS changes. That's a problem, so we'll get into that in a minute. But I want you to note, let's zoom in then, given name. Last name has a space, if you can tell it's there. Email address, same thing, space. Cell phone number has a space. Full name does not, because we didn't modify it. And that's a little quirky. So given all of that, what happened? Well, let's close out. Well, let's leave it alone for now. I'll close out the create. I want to get, trimmed down here a little bit just so we have a little more logic with our tabs instead of everything open. If we look at index.cshtml, we don't actually say first name in the header row. And this is the table. It's got one row at the top, and the TH stands for table header. And so this is a header entry. And so instead of saying, in quotes, first name, which we could do, we're saying no, use the Razor engine to get the display name for first name. So what it does by default is it says if I can't find any other name, I'll use the property name. And that's why we had the first name with no space. But if we have a display name property set, use that instead. And so it uses this instead. It says last name, or up here, given name. And so that's how we can modify the name without locking ourselves into changing our HTML every time, every place. So that's one of those nice little dry features, don't repeat yourself, that Razor adds, is it allows us to pull that display name, and then anytime, anywhere the display name is used, it will go ahead and show the actual display name we've chosen. Which means if I run this again, and I go to create a new person, it should also show up there. So let's go /people, create new, and notice right here, given name. And so both places were changed just by changing this entry right here. And that also keeps this information close to the actual property. Now let's get back and fix that CSS problem, which seems to be updated, but let's figure out why it's not actually displaying properly. So let's run this again. Since the 16 pixels is listed there, let's figure out why it's not actually showing the 16 pixel size. So if I hit F12 and I go here and I say grab Tim, and I look over here at the font size, it still says 12 on line 8270. Now that's interesting because it should be 16. And I hit Shift refresh and all of a sudden it displays. And so what happened was my Chrome had cached that page. and it said, since I already know what this bundle looks like, don't pull it again. We already have the information. But the information had changed, and it didn't realize that, and it should have. But if I hold Shift Refresh, it refreshed that page and fixed the CSS. So that's just something to keep in mind, that if you're banging your head against the wall, why didn't the CSS change, and you think it should, do a Shift Refresh just to make sure that you've cleaned out any cache that's holding on to a copy of local copy of your file. So that solves that problem. Now let's take out the full name column and keep going. So index.cshtml, take out the header row for full name, and then also take out the data row for the full name. We hit save. And now let's look at the create page a little more. So let's run this. So I open up create.cshtml, so it'll go right there, which if I can remember these things, it's a really nice shortcut. First of all, these are ridiculously tiny. Now let's make sure, yeah, see if I type Tim, that's a decent size. This, stupid tiny. Let's change that. So F12, we use a selector tool, select given name label, and if we look here, it's a label and the font size is 12. Ridiculous. Okay, 16, much better, much more visible. I would probably make it even a little bit bigger, maybe even look at what an 18 or 20 looks like. I like 18 better. So, bootstrap.css, line number 8313. Bootstrap.css, we're looking for 8313. There it is. And let's make that 18. Now notice it's changing a label, the radio label, the checkbox label, and the help block. So it's changing 4 different types, but they're all labels associated with an item. And so I want to see them all to be 18. So let's leave it like that. The other thing though is on our form we had a little bit of validation to say, on our win form, we had a little bit of validation to say, make sure that there is an entry for all 4 of these. And let's close out of our developer tools. Let's go back over to our tournament tracker C# and come back over to the create person and put our breakpoint there before we call this create person. And I just have Tim, I hit create. It goes there no problem. If we mouse over the P object, we'll notice that only the first name has a value, Tim. And of course, full name has the value of Tim space. Because we have no last name, we have no email address, we have no cell phone number. Well, we want better validation than that. So how do we add validation to our page? So we say, no, you can't have a person with a last name of length 0. So let's start with modifying our person model again. Now the first thing we did was we added this display name equals given name for our first name. But now let's add a limitation to it. So we can say, again, square brackets, string length, and let's start off with, it starts off with a maximum length. Now, I believe our maximum length for a name is 100 characters. That's a lot. But we can also say, comma, minimum length equals, and give a minimum length. Now, let's say that our minimum length is 2 characters. That means you can't use an initial for your first name. And that's all there is to it. So let's do the same thing for last name. Cell phone number, we should have a minimum of, let's say, 10 numbers. Now, depending on your country, that may be more or less. than necessary. So for the US, we typically drop the country code. We don't use that. But we have our area code, which is 3 digits. Then we have our actual phone number, which is 7 digits. So that's a total of 10 digits we need. So therefore, we're saying the minimum length is 10, maximum length 100 is probably excessive. Let's say 20. I believe that's what the SQL column is 20 in length. Now, I intentionally skipped over email address. Email addresses are tricky. Now, there is a way, and if you want to research it, you can. I'm not going to cover it in this video, but there's a way to apply a regular expression to the validation of this field. And what that would do is it would check for things like, does it have the @ symbol? Does it have a valid .com or .org or .net extension? And does it have a part before the @ symbol and a part after the @ symbol before the extension? And does it use only the correct characters? And there's a whole bunch that goes into it. The problem is that regular expressions with email addresses can get you close, but they can't get you perfect. And so you have to be careful. Do we really care that much? Now, the way we've solved it in our database is we've said we don't really care what you put in that email address field because we're going to email that address. Therefore, if you give us the wrong one, that's on you, not on us. And so we don't care. In a lot of applications, especially in the web, what we do is before you can confirm an account, you have to click a link that you get in that email address or at that email address. Therefore, we've confirmed that yes, you own that email address, yes, it's a valid email address, and yes, you have access to it. So there's things like that you can do that are much easier than trying to validate, is this a correct email address? But for our cases, we're going to say that it has to have a part before the @ symbol, a part after the @ a dot, and one other character at least. Let's say 2 other characters. That would make it a minimum length of 6 characters. So if you said a@t.co, well, that's 6 characters. So we're going to say a minimum of 6 characters. Now, I believe the maximum for an email address is 2,000 characters, but I could be wrong. But that's just ridiculous. You shouldn't write a book as your email address. So we're going to assume, and that can be dangerous, but you should know your application. We're going to assume that the email address will be no longer than 200 characters. Now, those are pretty simple validations. But what this does is if we check the validity of a model before we allow it to go through, we see if we don't allow it to go through until that is valid based upon these rules. And so that allows us to not submit a form when we otherwise would, and therefore it won't wipe out the data because it says, no, you can't submit the form until you made sure that you set this as valid. So let's leave this as it is, and let's just run it. We've added the 4 validations. They're all the same. They're all string validators. All right. So now let's go to /people. Say create new. I'm going to say, you know what? Don't care about given name, last name, email address, a cell phone number. Hit create. Well, guess what? It actually did something. And that's not good. So we need to turn on the looking for that validation. And this is where we get to add a jQuery validation JavaScript. Now, remember I said we're not going to get into JavaScript that much? And we're not. But in this case, we need to add a little bit of JavaScript, but it's already prepackaged for us. And if you notice, it's actually already here, which is kind of surprising at first. But we have this @section scripts. So what does this do? Well, if we look at our layout page. So we go back to the shared folder under views and go to underscore layout. Down here at the bottom, we have this @render section. The name is scripts. It's not required. But what this allows us to do is put scripts at this location right here. In this case, we're saying put the jQuery validation bundle at that location. And if we look up under bundles, we go to app start, bundles, the jQuery validation is just the jQuery.validate. So we're putting the validation on the page. And so what's supposed to happen is that when you exit a field, it checks to see if it's valid or not. If it's not valid, it should throw up an error. So why didn't it throw up an error? I'm going to show you why. This is one of those duh moments. I tab through, nothing happens. If I go to given name and say my given name is J, as in just the letter J, and I hit tab, check this out. The field given name must be a string with a minimum length of 2 and a maximum length of 100. That's validation. In fact, it won't allow me to create the form, nothing happens here, until I make sure this is valid. So why would it allow me to create the form if I had nothing in it? And that's because I didn't add one more required attribute. In fact, the attribute's called required. So I can say up here that the attribute is required. And say, you know what? You have to have the first name, a last name, and email address. You don't have to have a cell phone number, but if you do, it has to have a minimum length of 10. But you know what? We do texting, so you know what? We're going to require that too. So if you can't have a cell phone number and email address, you can't be in our tournament. Tough. We're the programmers, we create the rules. So that never works in the real world, but pretend it does. So now, if I go to create this form, it should stop me from submitting the form if I have nothing in one of the fields. So let's go to the end here and say /people, create new. And I'm going to tab through, nothing happens, but if I hit create, I now get 4 red boxes or 4 red error messages. The given name, the last name, email address, and cell phone number, they're all required. So now if I put J for my given name, now it changes to, yeah, you got something there, but it has to have a minimum length of 2. So now if I put JC, that's cool, that works. TC, that works. SF doesn't work because we have to have a length of 6. So AWER, not sure what that email address is, but pretend it works. And cell phone number required. If I hit create now before putting a cell phone number in, nothing happens. So that just makes sure that our form is at least somewhat valid before it even gets to C#. Now, that's using JavaScript. JavaScript is a front-end code that you can actually manipulate in real time in your browser using those same developer tools, which means you could bypass the check and go right to the submit. But we have tricks up our sleeves as well. So there is a thing called model is valid. It's actually model state. So let's go here and we're going to wrap this code right here with an if statement. So surround with, let's find surround in this list. This list is getting bigger and bigger, and so it's harder and harder to find stuff. And I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing a surround with. So I'm actually going to cut. It's a bummer. If, and I will say model state dot is valid. Not is read only, is valid. And if it is, run that code. But if it's not, then we should do something else. In fact, what we should do is return the view. So we'll say, you know what? If it's valid, go ahead and put it in the database. But if not, return the same create view. Now, I can't easily demonstrate that for you because I'd have to mess with the JavaScript inline, kind of muck around with that. Well, actually I can. Here's what we'll do. Come over here and we'll actually comment out this bundle. So we don't actually have validation in place. And now let's make the modification again, or run this application again and see what we get. So I should start right on the create page. I'm going to say my given name is T, last name is C. Notice no errors. And now let's actually put a breakpoint before we go on. Let's put a breakpoint in our code so we can see what happens. We'll start right at the if model state is valid, right there. So now I hit create. Model state dot is valid. It's true. Now, can you guess why it's true? The reason why is because we're returning a form collection. And we're doing this collection, first name, all the rest. So there is no data around what the model should be. How do we solve this? Well, check this out. What if we said the collection should actually be a person model instead, and we'll call it P, and we'll comment out all this code right here. Boop, gone. And now it's just a person model being returned with the post. Let's run this again. We'll get on the create page. We've still got the jQuery validation commented out. And so as soon as this starts, let's fill it in with sample data and hit create. Model state is valid is false. But check out the person model. It has all the values I passed in. They've populated the right fields. So the lesson here, and I should let that go. Let's let it go just so you can see what happens when it does that. I was trying to demonstrate and then I stopped it. So let's forget the rest, hit create. It's not valid, therefore this is what happens. It goes back to here and it actually yells at us and tells us what the problems are. And that's because it sent us back to this field. It did remember the T value, but it said, you know, that's not valid. So if you don't want to use jQuery validation, you can do a full post and it will send you back to this form if it's not valid, and it will tell you why. The problem is there's a round trip there, there's data being passed back and forth, there's page being reloaded. It's not the best way of doing things. So instead, what you want to do, we can get rid of this commented out code now. What you want to do is you want to make sure you also turn on your jQuery validation. That way, you have both options to you. You have the front end, which is slick and it happens right away. And if you type something and it's not valid and you tab away, it pops right up right away. But if somehow you have a person that's trying to be sneaky or just mucking around and they change the JavaScript so it says it's valid and you submit it to the server, it's going to come right back and say, nope, that wasn't valid. Here's the reasons why. So it really is a double check system. It's the slick UI in the front and it's the rock solid back-end code as well, because the user has no access to modify this stuff. All right. Now I did blow up my if statement. Let's figure out what I did there. Let's do this. That's what I did. I deleted a curly brace. There we go. So with that being the case, we now have passed back a person model. So you've seen how to do it with the form collection. And that's okay. It's not great, but it's okay. But then we also see how to do it using a model. Much easier to use. It takes advantage of the state of the model to make sure we have the validity of the model checked before we do anything else. and we can do something based upon that validity. Or we could even ignore that validity and still add them to the database. So if the model state is not valid, we don't have to do this check. This check is optional. So if we said, yeah, it's not valid, we want to capture it anyways, cool, go for it. But I would say in probably 95% of the cases, 99% of the cases, you'd want to check to make sure it's valid and then do something only if it is. Now, we have created our person form, we've created our person list, we've created our, add a new person, and the only thing I want to do before we finish this video off is I want to make sure that we change our home page to have, we'll go to layout, _layout. We want to change it so we have a link to our person. So let's copy this link right here and paste it. But I want to walk through what this is. So let's call it people. So this is an action link. So it creates a anchor tag in HTML. This is again Razor syntax. And so here is the name you want to give it. This is the visible name for the anchor tag. It doesn't have to be people. It can be anything you want. The people we want to add to our list could be the name of your action link. But then we pass in the action and we pass in a controller. So the controller in this case is the people controller. So the people controller, the index action, which is our list, and it says, we'll call it people. So now if we run this page, we're going to have a new menu item up at the top. Now I probably should have added this earlier because it would have made our lives a little easier when it came to debugging, but it is what it is. So now we have home, we also have people. People takes us right to the list here. We can create a new person and life is good. So that's really all there is to it. The one thing, I keep saying the one thing, but the one more thing now that I look at it that I want to change is I want to change this index and create to be something a little more intuitive. So let's go ahead and change that. And then that's all there really is to adding and viewing people in our database. So let's go back to the create page, go to top, and instead of calling it create, we're going to call it create new person. And then let's also look at this index page, and instead of calling it index, call it view all people. And we'll run those just to make sure they work. Of course, they will be just a simple text change, but you never know. So view all people and create new person. That's a little more intuitive, a little prettier. And so now let's just make sure this works by saying Diane Foster. We'll call it Diane at foster.net. And the cell phone number is 9986. We'll hit create. The cell phone number is not valid because we have to have an area code, 212-555. Now those dashes do count. So technically I only needed 1, 2, but that's okay. Now you can create, and now we see Diane Foster, Diane at foster.net, and the full cell phone number. But notice how nice that validation was. Right in line, told me the problem, I fixed the problem, I can still submit the data. Now again, this entry record, I'll probably blow that away manually, but that's a person we accidentally created empty before we had the validation in place. So all this works. So we now have our home page, which lists for us our active tournaments, and we have a way to view the people that are involved in any tournament and also create a new person if necessary. In the next lesson, we'll talk about creating a whole team based upon these people. So stay tuned for that.